press still hold power accountable, or has the media itself become a battleground? In this episode of Trailblazing Justice, we explore the evolving role of journalism in the age of Trump. Alice Lundell, OJRC's Director of Communication, joins us to discuss how the media landscape has changed, the challenges of maintaining truth amid rising disinformation, and why journalism remains essential to justice. It's all coming up on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 62, recorded Tuesday, May 6, 2025. State power versus free press, journalism in the age of Trump. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Here's Bobbin.
Welcome to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. My name is Bobbin Singh, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And today we're talking about the media landscape in the age of Trump. Today's guest is our Director of Communication, Alice Lundell, who will be talking about this very issue, her work in Oregon, and what we're seeing in the media today with press. And then do we actually live in a world where we have objective press anymore, or a common understanding of facts? Alice will get into all of that. Zach's also online with us today. Maybe he'll chime in and ask some questions. But Alice, do you want to give a little bit of background of who you are and how you came to Oregon?
Hi, Bobbin. Well, as you said, I'm Alice Lundell, and I'm the Communications Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. I've been in the role for almost 10 years now. In fact, we could do another episode in July and have a celebratory 10-year episode with me and Julia, who started on the same day. Julia, our Women's Justice Project Director. So I have been doing this for 10 years, but I've been working in media and communications as a space for more than 20 years now. I started off as a journalist, and I spent about a decade working as a journalist in the UK before I emigrated to the US. And I worked there in radio, I worked in television, doing local news, producing news, reporting news, presenting news shows. I worked for the BBC, first of all, for a few years. That was where I trained. And then I moved over to ITV News, which is another major broadcasting outlet in the United Kingdom. Once I moved to the US, I did a bit of a pivot. I decided that I didn't want to continue on in journalism, partly because of the jobs market and just the general media landscape here, which we'll, I'm sure, get into talking about that. But just also partly because I'd always been engaged with social justice issues and supporting causes and volunteering and wanting to make change in my community. And when I came here and kind of was rebuilding my life in a new country, something that I wanted to do was just take a bit of a change and get more involved in, actually, as opposed to just talking about what is happening in society, be kind of part of changing what's happening. And so I sort of moved into nonprofit communications, worked for a social service organization, first of all, and then 10 years ago, landed at OJRC, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, with your press background and journalism background, when we, hired for the director of communication position, it was one of the first of its kind in Oregon as it relates to organizations that work in the public safety sort of arena or civil rights areas. Communications has always been something that we struggled with as a movement or sort of our side. And so it was a bit novel when we decided to hire for a director of communications, and none of the other organizations really, civil rights organizations, Oregon really had that position. But now it seems like something that is necessary for each organization to really have. I mean, have you noticed, just generally speaking, any sort of, I guess, what's your thoughts on that as far as organizations now having communication directors?
Yeah, I think it's become essential at this point. I think for any organization to get its message out, to be heard in an increasingly crowded landscape above all of the myriad other causes that people are also paying attention to, and all the things that people have going on in their lives. You have to have somebody that is trying to craft a message for you and coordinate that and send that out into the world, hopefully in ways that are effective and people will engage with. So I think it's almost to the point now where a communications component, even if it's not a full-time position, would need to come into any nonprofit that somebody was starting very early in the process to really be effective, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say from my perspective, it has really helped our ability to grow as an organization and be more effective at the work that we do, to be able to have someone that can really be focused on, helping get our message out. But it's more than that. I mean, it's about sharing the work that we're doing, sharing the stories of the clients that we're working with, helping to engage our supporters, working with the press, obviously, and just helping think about like reports we put out, like what would be helpful for people, or how to put it in, help craft those reports or documents in ways that people will be able to hear it. So it is really important, especially with these systems that people don't have very much familiarity with. So in the past 10 years, you've been working on anti-mass incarceration efforts or civil rights issues around the criminal system. I don't know, what has been sort of your experience over the past 10 years? Has there been changes you've noticed, or what was it like at first for you coming into this space? What has there been an evolution, a positive one, or have we, does it ebb and flow, so to speak?
I think this kind of thing comes in waves. I think it's really important in communications, and what this basically is public relations and media relations that I'm doing. It's often not really called that in the nonprofit space, but this is PR. It's PR for a cause. And it does come in waves, and there's only so far that you can control the wave versus just try and ride the wave. And that's often a mistake, I think, that people make in the communication space, of thinking that they can entirely direct how their message is received. You could never completely do that. You can do your best to try and do that, but you can never completely do that. I think over these 10 years, we've seen growing awareness and interest in issues of mass incarceration and incarceration just generally, jails, prisons, how the justice system works, some issues like wrongful conviction. I think there's a lot more awareness that this is a real problem, that innocent people are truly being incarcerated, even in some, kind of almost unbelievable stories of how some people have ended up wrongfully convicted and incarcerated. That really does happen, I think, has come home to people a lot more. So I think the awareness is better. But the other component really is, to what extent are people supporting the messaging you're putting out? I think that, when we look back over the 2020s, the key point is going to be the murder of George Floyd, in terms of how people are responding to messaging around the justice system and policing and incarceration, because we did see a reaction principally from white people waking up. I think after George Floyd's murder, where there was more of a willingness among both politicians and the media, but also just in general in the community, to start to do some things to try to address racial justice. And part of that was dealing with the justice system and the prison system. What we've had subsequently is somewhat of a retreat from that, right? That has fallen out of favor somewhat, that has lost ground, I think. And I think it's a more difficult landscape for us now than it was 5 years ago to attract attention and support around anti-mass incarceration types of positions. So we see it move over time. Sometimes it's a little easier to get things done. Sometimes it's a little harder. But in general, over 10 years, I think more people have an idea that this is a real problem, right? And have bought into the basic notion that our prisons and jails have a lot of systemic problems that need to be addressed. Whether people have the same ideas about how to fix them maybe not, but just the general acceptance that abuses of government power, treatment of people, poor conditions, these are a bad idea because they are working against people's rehabilitation and hopefully future successful reentry. I think there's more people who've kind of gotten to that point now than there were a decade ago.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about, the landscape and, what has shifted. But, most of our work at its core is really describing or trying to share with people how state power is being used. And I say a lot of our work is really about the abuses of state power, because we're talking about the harms that individuals have endured or experienced, either going through the criminal system or things that led them into the criminal system, whether, it's abuses by law enforcement or prosecutors. Once they get into the system, how the system itself treats them, or the systems. Once they get into jails or prisons, again, we're talking about state actors, and even after incarceration, how the state systems treat those individuals. That's the common thread between all the different sort of work, or the diversity of work that we do and that we try to talk about. What is the biggest challenge that you have found in trying to share that with people, or get people to understand what it is we're trying to talk about, or the things that we're trying to change?
I think a really good example right now that is an illustration of this is the kind of online discussion that's happening around due process, because we're seeing attacks from the current administration on people's right to due process in the immigration space, right? People feeling that people are being snatched off the street, they're being spirited away, they're being deported, they're not having access to legal processes and opportunities that are intended to protect them against abuses by the state. And when you look at the online discussion around this, it is incredible to me the number of people whose rebuttal to complaints about a lack of due process is, well, if I were in that position, if I get, pulled over by a cop and they're asking me to show proof that I'm a citizen, right? Or they're asking me to, prove I'm in the country legally, or whatever it might be. The number of people who are saying, well, what I would do is I would call my lawyer, or what I would do is I would just tell the judge, or I would get out this piece of identification, And the number of people who don't understand that, like, when you hand your wallet over to the cop and they take out your ID and they rip it in half and throw it in the trash, like you just lost your proof, right? Mm-hmm. That if you don't ever get in front of a judge, that if you are never allowed to talk to a lawyer, like you can't justify attacks on due process by saying you would use due process to defend yourself against an attack on due process. Like people really do. And this is often, like, I think, rooted in identity, right? People who have identities that typically mean that they have not experienced the sharp end of government power abuse, whether that's based on racial identity, class, their wealth, all kinds of things. I mean, that people just have a very hard time getting into putting themselves in the position of somebody who doesn't materially have access to defenses against state abuse. And a lot of the situations we see come up for incarcerated people are like a microcosm of that, right? Endless situations that if a state official, if somebody working for the government did that to you in the outside community, there would potentially be some repercussions. There would be something you could meaningfully do to push back. But within prisons and jails, a lot of the time, the kinds of things you might try on the outside to protect yourself or defend yourself or speak up for yourself, when you're inside, is only going to make your situation worse oftentimes, right? You're going to get retaliation. We've got tons of stories about that. Mm-hmm. You're going to find that there are subtle ways that they're going to use power against you to make your life more uncomfortable and more unpleasant, meaning that the people who do end up speaking up are just incredibly brave to do so and know they're taking huge risks. So, the first thing I would say is just that when we talk about what a shift it is for somebody when they come into the system, whether they're still in the court system and the legal system, haven't yet been convicted, or whether they have been convicted and are now into prison or jail, or whether they're now out again, but are living with the consequences of felony convictions. It is really hard for people who haven't been pulled through that experience to kind of really get what it's like and how much of your autonomy is lost in that process, and therefore how much of your kind of control over how you live your life, what you can do in different situations. That I say is probably the biggest challenge. But another big challenge, frankly, is that there is a significant portion of the American public that not only doesn't regret abuses of government power, but actively desires them for people who are in prisons and jails. You know, you can see this in stories about anybody. You often see this against men who have committed crimes against women and children, particularly sexual crimes. The comments will be full of people who see no hypocrisy when commenting on somebody who's committed a sexual crime, wishing prison rape on those people. And they see absolutely no hypocrisy in suggesting that, you know, rape is wrong, so you should be taught that by going to prison being raped by somebody else. Like that, they think that is genuinely a logical position.
I mean, we see that like as jokes, right? And TV shows, and then, you know,
jokes about the showers, jokes about throwing soap, you know, and so on. Often racist jokes as well. It will often be jokes involving just really disgusting and distasteful things. And it is all of a piece of this idea that some people want prison to just be as grim and as painful and miserable as possible. They want the bad experience to be as much of a piece of it as just the loss of freedom, right? The denial of the right to go where you want to go and do what you want to do. So that is a problem, because there are people who just fundamentally don't agree that the abuse is even a bad thing. They actually see it as a good thing because they believe, likely falsely, that it will be a deterrent to people going into prison. Like, you won't commit the crime if you know that prison is going to be horrific. And then the final challenge, I think, is there are people who there's the people who either can't believe that it is that bad. Again, their personal experience hasn't shown them that. So they just have a hard time really believing it's that bad. I think that's probably a waning group of people, because I think more people have had, I think probably social media has helped to an extent, that more people are kind of having awareness and appreciation that it is that bad. And then the other group is the people who are kind of defeatist, right? The idea that everything is terrible all of the time, can't do anything about it, so why bother even trying, right? That is the kind of the position of like, there's no hope, it's dreadful, why are you even trying about it? So, that is a frustrating group of people to deal with, people who just relentlessly believe that no elected official, no correctional officer or official, nobody in any position of power will ever do the right thing ever, right? Which is if we really believed that in this organization, we wouldn't do this work, right? We didn't think it was possible to make any progress with anybody who has power over the situation. So, we are definitely against the defeatists.
Yeah, I mean, I think this segues into the next question kind of nicely, but there's a couple of themes that you've talked about that we'll touch again a little bit later in the conversation. One, I do want to touch upon how the local or state level actions or efforts like around the carceral system and how that translates or trickles up in the connection to what we're seeing with Trump, because I think you touched upon the desensitization or the lack of information or misinformation people have about the carceral system and what it means. But, we see a lot of that playing out at the national level right now as well. So I'm just going to put a pin on that. But the other one is generally this idea of disinformation or lack of information, because all the challenges that you mentioned really stem from, it seems like, the root cause being people not being fully aware or having lack of information or are misinformed about the criminal system, how people go through it, how law enforcement actually operates, how prosecutors operate, what it's like in jails and prisons. A lot of it is, some of it is because it's been sort of mythologized in TV shows and, and sort of mainstream media. And so I guess, like, what is the danger you see? And this is sort of like a softball question, but like the dangers about the public not largely being unaware about mass incarceration, because that seems to be, at its core, the biggest challenge. So from like a communications or a media or, whatever, from like your perspective, I mean, what do you see as the biggest dangers?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that lack of information or lack of knowledge is the biggest challenge, because I think that is a significant portion of it. But I do think there are people who are perfectly well informed. They're just fine with it, right? I think it's like almost parallels the mistake that sometimes is made around when, some of the national media would visit small town USA and report on Trump voters and ascribe the whole reason why people were voting for Trump to this economic anxiety, right? It's just because we're concerned about jobs and wages. There's no other reason. And yet, like, subsequent research has not borne that out, right? It shows that factors like anti-immigrant sentiment and racism and a desire to get back to a mythical past that was better, like a lot of these things are actually real components of why people are supporting. So with mass incarceration, it's not just people not knowing, it's about just the story of this country being state power, including the power to incarcerate people, being turned against groups of people or against individuals who have been deemed undesirable or a threat to, the good order as it is considered by people in power. So, people are very prone to think it can't happen to me until it's too late, right? And then it is too late, and there's nothing you can do at that point. But there is a degree to which that is a rational view. I've been driving in the US for 13 years. I've yet to ever be pulled over by police because I'm a middle-aged, middle-class white woman, and also a very sensible driver, I would like to say. So that is part of it. But also, it isn't irrational for somebody like me to think I probably won't get pulled over by police, right? So if I had something in my car, which I'd like to point out to Portland police, I do not, that is kind of illegal or untoward, I probably wouldn't get caught because I don't look like people that they are targeting. Mm-hmm. So, people do to some degree make a judgment that they are immune from some of the consequences of mass incarceration and abuse of state power. And that is somewhat of a rational view to some degree for some of us. But, in the end of the day, we are in a position where some people want those who are incarcerated to suffer and to also cost them, basically nothing to incarcerate. But at the same time, you're supposed to get out of prison in perfect physical and mental health, have no trauma, slide gracefully into a good middle-class job and like join a bowling league or something, right? You're basically supposed to be suffer as much as possible, but it doesn't damage you, so you can come out and immediately be productive, right? That's kind of the narrative that many people are thinking should be happening. It's a lack of examination of the realities and real thought about what incarceration does to people, coupled with just a desire for vengeance and punishment. And I think also, in fairness to people, it is also a real response to a lack of effective healing and a holistic approach to the harm that's done to them. Because if you have been horribly wronged by somebody, and the government and society are not going to do much for you to help you get better from that, if you even can, then maybe the only thing available to you is to feel like the person who did it is going to suffer now, right? And some people are going to get satisfaction with that.
Just to reaffirm the point that you made that, it's not solely about like a lack of information or misinformation, and that, as Erin mentioned in her immigration podcast that she did, cruelty is the point. And Brian Stevenson, famous attorney out of Alabama, director and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, talks about, the founding value system of this country being white supremacy. And, it started with a genocide of the indigenous or native population. It then, turned into, slave trade so there's always been this domination and control and removal type of value system that's existed from the inception of this country, starting with the genocide, then bringing a population over and having them, in the labor, at slavery, and then so on and so forth with additional populations. And it's just sort of shifted and evolved over the past 200 years in different ways. But the systems have always been set up to sort of dominate, repress, remove certain populations. So again, it's just to, reaffirm the point of what it is that you're saying, that this is sort of baked into our value systems. It's not just about like a lack of information or misinformation, but it is about a value system that people do believe in or adhere to. And then with that, before we kind of move on from this, from a communication standpoint, how do we engage with that? As you mentioned, George Floyd presented after George Floyd's murder, there was an opportunity, it seemed like, to really have a conversation about that history, to talk about this value system, but it's kind of shifted away at this point. The initial sort of conversation was seemingly in a very positive trajectory, but then the response seems to be, sort of what we're experiencing now. So, do you think we'll get back to a point where we can talk about this kind of this history of the United States and that core value system that sort of has driven this country?
My kind of big idea about that, I guess, which is kind of outside the scale of this specific issue, is that until the US engages fully in a truth and reconciliation process, we're never going to get past this. We're going to keep getting dragged back into the past in a way, because until you really confront what you've done to people and address that, you can't, you can't ever move past it. I'm, as well as being British, I'm also Irish, so I have the experience of what's happened in Northern Ireland to look at in terms of how people have tried to go through an honest reckoning with the past and everything that happened during the Troubles and the Civil Rights era in Ireland for decades, and trying to address the harm that's been done and the many injustices that have happened and what people have done on both sides to injure and to kill each other, and that has made some progress. There has been some movement. There's a long way to go yet. You could also look at South Africa as an example there. But I do believe until the US can get to a truth and reconciliation process, it will never really happen. But yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but that's what I mean.
No, I think it is. And the reason why I wanted to open up the conversation today, just talking about this, because I think it helps set a foundation or some context for the next part of the conversation, which is, media in the age of Trump and kind of what we're seeing, because I think the dynamics and the work that we've been doing, the efforts to talk about state abuses of power, all help, provide some situational location for us and sort of the next conversation, or what we're going through as a country. But before we jump into all of that, can you just give us some thoughts on what you think the current landscape of the local media is, the national media, how you think it's changed in the past 10 to 15 years? And then what are the biggest challenges for the media and press currently? It's a lot to cover, right?
Yeah. Well, let me just give you an example from right before we jumped on this podcast. That is a perfect example. I just opened up Facebook, and on my Facebook feed, I saw a post from the Malheur Enterprise, which is the newspaper over in Malheur County, and they announced that they're closing this week. The proprietors looks like retiring, I think, just based on, they've reached a point in life. They want to have a break, understandably. And they don't describe, kind of very specifically any attempts they may have made to sell the paper or find someone to take it over. But they kind of allude to the fact that a local newspaper is not exactly a way to make money these days. And it sounds like they haven't, whatever efforts they have made to sell, maybe have not found a buyer or not found somebody who'd be interested in taking over and taking on the work of running a newspaper both as a business, but running it as a journalism enterprise at the same time. So Oregon is about to lose another newspaper, which is a real shame, especially with Enterprise having done some pretty interesting work, and I believe won some awards as well for its journalism efforts. But, the internet has changed everything. Basically, Google ate newspapers' lunch. Up until maybe the 90s, a newspaper was a very reasonable way to make money, potentially make a lot of money. And since advertising revenue has dried up in many ways, and the online advertising revenue for digital versions of news outlets has not replaced what they used to get from newspapers. Something to understand is if you were a newspaper subscriber back in the day, you were in no way, shape, or form the main funding of most newspapers, right? They mostly made their money out of advertising. Getting your subscription money was a nice addition, but it was not the main way that they were staying afloat. And no one has yet really figured out the funding model post digital news. People have tried nonprofit, but is that really working out fully? When Jeff Bezos when he first bought the Washington Post, some people saw that as potentially a fantastic thing because he was somebody coming in with such extraordinarily deep pockets that if he wanted to, he could keep throwing millions of them every year, for the rest of his life and still have plenty of money left over in a way that even most big newspaper proprietors can't do. But obviously they've had their issues around his control of the narrative there, editorial positions, opinion pieces, and so on, right? And some people have resigned over that. And then there's a venture capitalist model. There have been, unfortunately, a lot of newspapers around the country that have been stripped out by venture capitalist firms, buying up scores of papers, slashing jobs, and really, really decimating these places. And a lot of places kind of either closing down or becoming just an absolute fragment of what they used to be. I'm only going to give you a couple of stats in this entire podcast, but I'm going to do it now. So fair warning to you. My national stat for you is from 1990 to 2008, about 25% of all newspaper jobs vanished in the US. And then post-Great Recession, another 74% of that workforce has disappeared. So a large portion of jobs in the newspaper industry that existed in 1990 have now gone. And then in Oregon specifically, last year, the Oregonian did a story saying that since 2001, the data showed 3/4 of Oregon journalism jobs had disappeared in the last, just over 20 years. Mm-hmm. So this is an industry where a very large proportion of jobs have gone. There are a very small number of papers doing well, like the New York Times, for example. But even that is basically a gaming website now. Like a lot of their traffic is people going to do their Wordle every day. And it is very difficult to see how it's going to work out. And the newspapers matter because newspapers are where the news starts, right? Broadcast media tend to look to newspapers to find the stories. A lot of times, if you look at what gets covered in TV news, frequently it's stuff that has already been covered by newspapers. And that was even more true when the newspapers were more robust. Local media has had a harder time than national media because they never had as strong of finances. They didn't have as broad a base of subscribers. They're often in areas that aren't as financially strong as some of the very wealthy large cities that some of these big papers are based in. And that's why you're seeing rural areas, small town newspapers being hit the hardest. One of the interesting case studies in Oregon actually is Eugene. The Register Guard was bought by Gannett, which is one of these notorious venture capitalist places. They cut nearly all of the journalists from the Register Guard from what was like a pretty robust, significant newspaper within Oregon. The Oregonian reported a couple of years ago that Register Guard staffing level was once as high as 80 and was now down to 6. So you imagine any workplace, if you went from 80 people to 6, what kind of state do you think that business would be in? There is a new startup in Eugene area. It's called Lookout Eugene Springfield. They recently launched, trying to fill the local news gap and based on a model coming out of Santa Cruz. So there are people trying to find ways to produce either digital only or very much digital first outlets to kind of fill in behind some of these, destroyed local papers. But it's very tough. There's a quote that I really like from David Simon, who created The Wire. And about 15 years ago, he gave an interview. So this was right as the recession was happening. And he predicted, he said, to be a state or local official in America over the next 10 to 15 years. So that takes us up to where we are now, right? Before somebody figures out the business model, to gamble freely across the wastelands of an American city as a local politician. It's got to be one of the great dreams in the history of American corruption. So basically they're just summing up how when you just cut out the accountability portion that you can get from news outlets who are making public records requests, who are asking difficult questions, when you just erase that, who exactly is going to know what's going on, right? Because so much of what's on social media is just regurgitated or it's opinion. The actual news reporting is a skill that requires professionals. And a large proportion of those professionals are no longer in the profession of journalism.
Well, I want to get us to this point, but I was just thinking as you were talking about all this, when I was growing up, we used to have a newspaper delivery every day, including the weekends. And one of my favorite things to do is when my father would come home from work, he would have the newspaper, is I would spend 30, 40 minutes just reading through everything, just glancing through all the papers. I'd go to the sports section first and then kind of work my way back to the news and everything like that. And then the comics, of course, were always fun. But I just remember how interesting it was to open up a newspaper and then just read about stories that you wouldn't come across. Like I wouldn't, you're just looking at, you're not choosing what you're reading. It's just being presented to you. And I was just reading it, even in stories that I had no interest in or had no background or knowledge or didn't know that I was interested in until I read it. And what I find now is, with online media and not having that newspaper experience anymore, is that, you're selecting what issues, what stories, that you want to read rather than being presented with a variety or diversity of news. So you end up creating, at least for myself, a bit of an echo chamber, and I have to be sort of intentional about sort of breaking out of that. And it's a very obvious way of sort of asking, how has now the current landscape and sort of what you described, we talk about like disinformation, misinformation, echo chambers. I just kind of presented it, but can you talk more about that a little bit and how we've reached this point of where it almost feels like we have competing, we don't have this shared common understanding of facts anymore, truth, or there's not. And that is one of the things that bound us, for such a long time.
Yeah, you're talking basically there about information silos, and we all live in one, right? We all have preferences. We are being served content by algorithms on social media, and you see more and more of the things you respond to, that you're interested in, that you react warmly to. The algorithm sees that and gives you more and more. So you live in an information bubble that, and we all do this, right? Every single person who's engaging with this stuff online is living in a bubble where you're interacting with other people of similar viewpoints or similar circumstances, situations, and you think that you're seeing, kind of what is out there, but you're not. You're seeing a tiny piece. We did see this with the election result in November. Like, I think a lot of people reacted in quite a lot of shock because what they had been seeing on social media in terms of their bubble reflected maybe a differing level of support for the candidates that made them think that there was going to be a different outcome, made them think that Harris would win, because that's the kind of stuff they were seeing over and over again. And they weren't seeing everything that was being presented to people on the other side or people who are in the middle ground who could be swayed in different directions. So it's really difficult when there's such a flood of information out there we can all only see a piece of it. The main thing I can say, if you take anything from today, please subscribe to your local paper, right? Because however much you may not like all of their reporting, if you want it to be better, you have to pay for it. It isn't free. It's very expensive to do good journalism. It's particularly expensive to do the types of investigative journalism that people often say they want. It can take months to put something together. It is also the case that, you can spend a lot of time pursuing a story and it doesn't ultimately pan out. So it never even gets published. So people spend months on something that never goes anywhere sometimes. And all of that has to be paid for. So you just, you can, for a relatively low amount, you can get a digital subscription to some of the local outlets. And I really encourage, if you possibly can, to do that, because that is our best hope. That is where we are going to get new and good information from. The lack of the influence and power of the news outlets is a factor in the rise of disinformation online. It is not the only one, but because they do not have as much clout as they did, they are not as big within the public square as they used to be. It is harder for them to act as a check on disinformation. I will say that even if, somehow news outlets had magically instantly figured out the pivot when online came around and sorted out their funding and had all of the staff they used to have, you'd still have misinformation online, but there would just be a more powerful force to potentially counter it. There is an argument that there are multiple versions of the truth, because how do you ever get to an unbiased view of any situation, right? We see that when you look at the role of eyewitnesses in wrongful convictions, right? When you ask a group of people what just happened in that incident you witnessed, you are going to get different stories from different people, and people will fervently believe that their version is true because that's what I saw. But they don't, have a hard time grasping that your brain is constantly filtering, and you are even filtering out things that are happening right in front of you and kind of discounting them because you don't recognize their significance or you don't understand what it means, right? So you don't see it because your brain is telling you that doesn't matter. But really, without a more robust media, particularly local media, since so much power is held at the local level, we are not really going to get to the point where we can effectively counter disinformation.
So, we've talked about, multiple information silos and sort of selective ways in which people are engaging with information. But you also presented that quote about how without a check of the press on politicians or elected officials, there's the ability for corruption to grow. We see this combination where there's this gap and also the combination of disinformation, right? So that you don't have anything accounting or holding accountable elected officials, but then you also have essentially outlets that are pushing certain information that are, supporting a candidate or pushing out a public official sort of perspective or ideology. That's at least the environment it feels like that I feel like we're living in, that has allowed someone like Trump to come up and begin to push all these policies, these anti-civil rights sort of agenda, anti-constitutional agenda. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I think that's true. I will say that what I have, maybe been a little harsh about is, and kind of neglected to talk about, is the internet and social media also are a gathering point for minority groups of all kinds or minority viewpoint groups. And that has value, and it has been enriching for people and empowering for people, and has facilitated people's organizing and coming together online, whether it's just for kind of reassurance of being in community with people who are like you, or whether it's to, kind of strategize about ways to hold power to account. So there is another side to it in terms of the internet and online spaces and things have created some opportunities to challenge power. And it is true that mainstream media did often tend to go with a kind of what they would see as a middle ground, kind of most acceptable opinion, which tends to be what suited majority groups in any one situation, and power groups, right, which is going to tend to undermine perspectives that are shared by minority groups of different kinds. So the internet is helping to challenge that. But, overall, we are very far from what we kind of once dreamed of, those of us who were kids on the internet a long time ago, where the internet was going to be a kind of a golden landscape where you could access anything from anywhere in the world. You could find out anything you wanted to know. People from all parts of the planet would come together and would talk to each other and would get to know each other and understand each other better through that process. And you could make friends everywhere and be in community, and everything was going to be great, right? Everything was going to be so much better online, and online was going to be kind of positive only and just like a great addition to our lives. Instead of where we are kind of 25, 30 years later, where the internet has taken over large parts of our lives, the internet has destroyed parts of our lives, and it has really been a critical piece in rising authoritarianism in many places in the world, because it has allowed both surveillance monitoring of people. It has allowed the spread of disinformation. It has driven people into, narrow kind of channels, columns of information where they're not seeing other perspectives. And it means that if you are a kind of charismatic, telegenic figure, which I will always maintain that Trump very, very much is, if you have a powerful kind of projection of your personality, as he does, this is just a perfect environment for you to be able to exploit and build and grow an increasing audience for perspectives, and get people to get behind you in ways that aren't necessarily even very much based on your policies, that it's kind of based on vibes. It's like, you are the sort of person that I like and I want to get behind. And that's what he has done with incredible skill.
Yeah. And, I want to come back to this point. I'm just putting it out here so I don't forget, but you're talking about the perfect environment for someone like Trump to sort of emerge and do the things that he's doing. But one of the things that is also very troubling is the way in which he is using that value system of punishment and othering and amplifying that through these channels now in ways that people are, getting very supportive and very, things shifting conversations very quickly, like on a daily basis. And what would be, what would have been, I would say, a ridiculous conversation 5 years ago is now a normal conversation these days, as far as the types of things that we're talking about, the types of things that that's even being considered as, something to talk about. I mean, there's like legitimacy to whatever it is that's being proposed. And I find that horrifying, but we'll come back to that. One of the interesting things that you mentioned is, and it is true, like social media and online platforms have been something that have helped strengthen advocacy and civil rights. At least it did for a while. We saw it during 2020 or post George Floyd murder and the racial justice sort of uprising that happened, that Twitter was used as a way to keep track of things, keep on top of where, harms were happening, protest, a way to communicate. It was also a way to bust through the silos of the media and press, and to be able to share information that was more horizontal rather than top down. So there was a lot of benefits to that. But what we saw from that perspective is, from sort of like the civil rights, racial justice community, kind of attack on the press, talking about what you're saying, the middle ground and how the press was being used to help sustain these systems of white supremacy. But then you add in someone like Trump and on the right, who from the very beginning of his sort of campaigns, in ways that other, I think, Republicans or conservatives in the past, they had criticized the press, but Trump just made it a centerpiece of, or at least one of the core pieces of his campaign was to attack the press and to delegitimize them, and really sort of, it was something unprecedented. So then you have this combination of like both sides attacking the credibility of the press. I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that may have contributed to sort of the current press landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think the struggling financial side of the media is kind of where it starts, right? The legacy media struggling to figure out not just newspapers, but also things like cable news, struggling to figure out how to survive. A lot of this stuff is maybe ultimately dying a slow death, and we may look back in 20 or 30 years and see this as a process in which we were moving on to just completely different forms of media. So Trump, starts from a point where he has a weakened enemy, right? And he's clearly viewing a lot of that legacy media, that kind of mainstream media, as it is sometimes called, as an enemy. So they're starting from a weakened position. And then he is recognizing that the new world of press that matters is not anything we have thought of as press, right? He doesn't need the New York Times now. If he was doing all of this 30 years ago, he would never have gotten to this point without major national outlets, without being on the big legacy news stations. Like it just wouldn't be possible to craft a successful national campaign without them. He doesn't need them now, right? The most important media interview that happened last year was Trump on Joe Rogan's podcast, and arguably also Harris not on that podcast, right? He's starting to, the White House press pool has always had an independence issue because it's access journalism, right? Your success reporting the White House, a lot of that is about staying close to the administration and to a degree not rocking the boat, right? There's arguments about how far you can really go with that kind of journalism when you need that access. But now we're very much moving into press as public relations. There are more so, podcast hosts, bloggers, people coming from new media areas on the right and on the far right who are being brought into the press pool, who are getting to ask questions when they have press rounds in the White House. People like Tim Pool, he's a podcaster that's accused of links to the Kremlin, right? There's some of these people that are coming in that are not really reporters in a sense that I would recognize as doing real journalism. They are essentially extremely clearly advocating for a particular perspective. And Trump is kind of setting it up as, okay, we've got our media landscape on the right, like these are our people, our favored people, and the failing, New York Times or however he's calling them on the other side, he's trying to position them as just a left-wing version, not that many of them are that left-wing, of what he's now kind of cozying up to on the right. He's creating this like false dynamic where the old media, they don't want to tell the truth to you. They want to lie about me. They're socialists or communists or whatever he's saying, right? Which is far from the truth. So he is trying to set up a dynamic where none of the media can be trusted and all media is highly partisan. He would love it if all media became extremely partisan and people completely gave up on trying to just report the facts, because that is really helpful to him in trying to discredit the idea that anybody can ever get to the truth or anybody can ever give you kind of, as best they can, unbiased, fair reporting. So he's very much supporting this development of more of kind of like a court with courtiers kind of vying for the king's attention, more so than the idea that as an elected official, he should be subjecting himself to scrutiny and examination by, people whose job it is to uphold the First Amendment.
And, I think, it's one thing for civil rights organization, racial justice supporters, to be using alternate media and mediums to communicate and lift up stories. And even I would say for people running for elected office to have, use alternative channels as well to kind of lift themselves up from a political standpoint. I think it's horrific and, profoundly disturbing in the ways in which the right wing and especially Trump have attacked the media. But I think now we're kind of entering a very different territory where Trump is elected as president and is now using the awesome power of the federal government to attack the press. And so we've seen it with the Associated Press. We've seen it now with NPR. with the settlement or the conversations about 60 Minutes. I mean, lawsuits against these media companies. And it seems to be an all-out attack on the First Amendment. For however, I don't know. Like we were just talking about how the accountability of the press had withered. Whatever is left was remaining is being, violently attacked now by this administration with the force of the federal government. Can you speak a little bit to that and like what this represents at this point? Like what sort of new chapter we've entered now?
I think, there's no real kind of sign of interest really from Trump and the White House in a free flow of accurate information. Like that is not a priority, shall we say. So he's going to carry on attacking fake news. He wants people to doubt what they're seeing and reading and think that what they're being told by legacy media is made up or it's all just biased, so that, some people will believe him fully and will kind of join the MAGA, kind of cult. And some people won't necessarily believe it fully, but they will cast enough doubt that they're going to just give up paying attention to the media because they're going to feel like, I can't really know. How can I be sure? There's a lack of trust now in big institutions. So people feel like, I don't know, I'm just going to switch it up. So it's a piece of that kind of anti-elite messaging from the billionaire from New York, right? He's telling us that, with things like universities and academics, it's the same thing. It's like the elites don't have your best interests at heart. They only care about themselves, and they are trying to alter American society in unhealthy, harmful ways. They're almost kind of like they're doing experiments on us, right? Like this is the way he's trying to portray what people like the media or people like academics are doing to try and make it seem like this is almost like sinister, like it's a plot. You can't trust them. They're up to no good. They have devious motives. They certainly aren't going to be fair or honest or truthful to you. So just stop listening to them. His best hope is probably to get people to stop listening, more so than thinking he could get everybody to actively support him. And if he can do that, if he can turn people off from just listening, paying attention, he is won at that point, right? Because he knows how to be loud and shouty even without the media, but some of his opponents don't know how to do it, maybe.
I mean, what does this mean for the media that does remain as far as their ability to be able to report on Trump? Do they? I mean, obviously the intent is to create a chill. I mean, how does that connect to undermining democracy? Because, it is the First Amendment, right? The freedom of the press. And I mean, are we at a point where, this whole construction of the First Amendment exists, as we've known it? Is it even, I mean, does media matter at this point? I mean, can they stand up to this?
I think they can. I think they have to. A challenge, I mean, we have seen shifts with the media and Trump. If you think about 2015, 2016, when he came down the golden escalator and he was, came out and many people, I mean, I completely was one of them, did not believe that he could possibly win. Right? Even right up until it happened, it just seemed like a ridiculous notion. So you had the media trying to have their cake and eat it by running so many stories about him in that first campaign and making a big deal of him and paying attention to all of the crazy things he would say. Very intentionally, because it got ratings, it got viewers, it stirred up controversy. Since that time in the last 10 years, there's been way more, understanding come through that is really harmful and dangerous to do that. There's a lot more attempts to kind of fact check him in real time to kind of quote what he said, but also say, this is a racist statement or this is inaccurate because blah, 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 right? And they'll cite the contrary evidence. So they are trying to be more kind of direct and specific in addressing Trump's, Trump's misinformation and trying to make it this is what he says, but this is what is actually the case. But the public is also, I think, gets sick of depressing news. I think it's a difficult time economically, and things are looking like they're potentially getting worse. The economy certainly feels like it's less stable than it was 6 months ago. That tends to make people tend to switch off when the news is too depressing. So it's a difficult bind for the media to know how to address this. I think the media role is critical, and it still makes a difference every day. I can think of stories here in Oregon that have absolutely changed what has happened when elected officials resign after corruption is exposed, or when a policy is changed or dropped because of the problems with it that are shown. But the more of that you want, like I come back to my point, you've got to subscribe, because the more of that you want them to do and the more effective you want them to be, you've got to support them. And there needs to be a way to make news work in an era when everyone is not going to be, picking the newspaper up off their doorstep every morning, right? We need to get to a place where we can make the news model work. Because if we don't have it, we are already feeling, and we will feel even more so, the loss of it.
And, there's an interesting point you made. And I think this is, I would say, more to do with the fact that Congress has sort of abdicated its role, at least the majority party, in governing. Is we have had at the local level, whether it's, through some of the various media outlets where they've reported on misconduct, by elected officials that has resulted in those elected officials having to step down from their office. But at the national level, there doesn't seem to be, at this point, anything anyone can say or do to expose Trump in any way that actually has any sort of repercussions. Do you think that's true? Or do you think there's opportunity for the press to be able to continue to try to hold the press? I mean, I'm of the belief that the press has to memorialize this and document it, like, for historical reasons. But I just don't know in the current moment if there's any consequence to it.
Yeah, I mean, people call him Teflon Don, right? That he just has this kind of preternatural ability to have uncomfortable things slide off him. Mm-hmm. When the Access Hollywood tape came out right before the election years ago, people thought, like, oh, there's no possible way, A, that he could stay as the candidate, but he did, B, that he could win, but he did. It is, he's basically set fire to kind of conventions, expectations, the way things were always done, a lot of stuff that maybe sometimes wasn't codified and just relied on people doing the right thing and being the right sort of person who would follow the unspoken rules. And he isn't following any of them. And that's something that some of the people that support him, I think, really love about him, that he's not trapped by convention, right? He's not going to kind of just go along with how things always were, because that's how they always were. I think it's memorializing when the press reports what he does, but I also think that he has some sensitivity to bad press, and I think he has shown that with the tariffs. With the tariffs, where he has changed his position quite a few times, he has exempted certain types of goods, or he has delayed the tariffs, or he has changed the amount of the tariffs. Like, he has demonstrated some willingness to shift based on bad press, even on something that he's believed in for a long time, like the tariffs, something that is somewhat of a signature policy for him. So I suspect that if the press can manage to continue to attach negative consequences for voters to Trump, such as, for example, if we have an economic downturn, people are losing jobs, people see their incomes falling, people are feeling their finances are more precarious. If that can be attached to Trump as a consequence of his policies, that could be very powerful in shifting what he does, because he doesn't want to be unpopular. You can't be an unpopular populist and get very far, I think.
So, I mean, I guess the last question I have, because I think you've done a really wonderful job of kind of setting everything up, is what are the biggest challenges that you see in the press trying to cover Trump at this point? And then also for the public, and to navigate what feels like a very chaotic media scene.
I mean, the thing with Trump is, he was trained very well by Roy Cohn, who was kind of his mentor. about how to do media relations or public relations, right? You basically make yourself into the story. You become a big personality, which Trump certainly is, right? We can all think of things that we associate with Trump, like the hair, the tan, the suit, the red tie, the golden toilet in the bathroom, like so many of these things that are like signature Trump things. Even before he went into politics, he had like an image, which was why he did cameos in movies and TV shows, because as soon as the audience saw him, they're like, oh yeah, Donald Trump, I know who that is. He's a big shot, developer guy, casino guy, hotel guy. He had this image that he had built. He knows how to exaggerate. He knows how to leverage any situation, even when you are seemingly would be on the back foot because you've done something controversial. You turn around and you make yourself a story, you shift the narrative. If you get criticized, you play the victim, right? You use it to gain sympathy for yourself, and you relentlessly use the media on the attack. So, he is such a skilled media operator. He has demonstrated that. Like, no one gets to the position he's in twice without having done that well, disturbingly well, perhaps. But he can be, I think, subjected to the same scrutiny that all elected officials should be subject to. And I think it can have some effect over time. Maybe the biggest difficulty is his volatility. He will change his mind a lot. He will shift kind of almost on a dime on issues. And he seems to almost be kind of captured by the kind of the last person he talked to or the last thing that he saw or heard about, right? That he's easily influenced by the most recent perspective that he's encountered, which seems to make him kind of shift around in ways you couldn't necessarily expect. So it is a tricky thing, but I think that it is possible for the media to find ways to kind of really show what he's doing and what the consequences of that are in a way that allows people to form their own judgments, which is what should be happening. People should be making their own assessment and deciding whether what they're seeing is the kind of country they want to live in, whether it's the kind of economy they want, the kind of legal system they want, kind of politics they want. Twice, the message from voters has been, this is what we want, right? This is the place we want to live in. This is the way we want to go. It's frightening when you look at what some, academics and writers on things like authoritarianism, anti-democracy movements, fascism, etc., what they're saying about where we could be going, right? This could be the beginning or partway through the slide. We could be going down from here. There's no guarantee that we're going up in 2028 at all, particularly as Trump has started floating the idea that he might get a third term. But if we've seen anything in the last 100 days, the first 100 days of Trump, is that the people who are standing up have achieved something, right? Fighting back, pushing back has achieved something. If all it's doing is slowing things down when it comes to bad policies, that is an achievement. So, media spotlight on what Trump is doing, I think does have value, does have impact, and it does help those in the public who are kind of feeling bewildered by what they're seeing happen to recognize that they're not alone in feeling that, and that their perspective, even if it isn't being heard as loudly, is a real one that many people share.
Yeah. What advice would you give to the public?
On
just how to navigate through all of this. I mean, I think you've alluded to a few different things, but what would you share to like our supporters or people listening to this podcast?
I would say to look widely at a variety of sources, to look at international sources, to look at sources of media that are not sort of major legacy outlets. Try and look beyond that to, for example, media organizations that serve, different groups within the US, whether it's by region or whether it's, whatever it might be, like trying to look outside of just the big voices. Mm-hmm. and be endlessly skeptical of people who are giving you easy answers and are telling you not to look any further. Like, anyone tells you not to look into something more deeply and just to trust them should be a huge red flag. So, always watchfulness, scrutiny, and not cynicism, but, a degree of skepticism, shall we say. And then also not obsessing. I think the worst thing you could do would be constantly have like cable news running and be on, X scrolling and, constantly following the media churn. I don't think any of us needs to do that or should be doing that. So taking a break is good. I think having maybe, a switch off from time to time is a good thing.
Well, thanks, Alice. I mean, we're just over an hour. There are a couple of things that I wanted to follow up on and discuss. One of them was this idea that we sort of talked about earlier on about the challenges of the work that we do and trying to get people to understand what's happening with state abuses and getting the media to cover it, or getting our stories out there and people to relate to these, this sort of the state violence or the state harms that are happening. And I'm very much of the idea of, unless you practice, especially like with civil rights, unless you practice standing up for people, unless you practice advocating for people, even in small ways, it's very challenging for us, like in these big moments right now that we're facing, to have the ability to exercise, those muscles and to be able to really stand up in big ways. So, one of the things that, we'll talk about is, for our staff to continue to dig into our work and push back against the abuses of government, state actors, because at its core, this is what we're doing, even at the federal level, or we may eventually have to do more of, which is push back against the federal government. And unless we're practiced at doing that, we're not going to be able to do it. And I see sort of a parallel with the press, like unless the press has the ability to practice that skill of investigative journalism, looking into stories or issues more deeply, or having the ability to try to hold state electeds or federal electeds or actors accountable, then it's very hard to get them to do it in moments like this. Not to say that it's not happening. I think there's a lot of good journalism that is happening at this point. But I think what I'd like to do is have a follow-up conversation with a number of people from our staff to talk about this connection of what's happening in our state carceral systems and how at the federal level, and sort of the other side of this is like, we are very practiced at detaining people, arresting people, picking them up off the street, putting them in these like very disturbing environments, such as prisons and jails, depriving them of dignity. We're even very practiced at removing people from their communities and putting them in places that they don't belong, such as like in Hawaii, they move their prisoners or their individuals in custody to a private prison in Arizona. And so this is all things this country is like very practiced at, and we're just seeing the other side and Trump sort of really engaging with what this country is good at. And, I just want to sort of connect the dots between our carceral system and what we've seen over the past like 30, 40 years with the growth of mass incarceration and how that's trickled up to what it is that Trump's doing, and connecting those dots a little bit more clearly for people. But the media and communications is part of that conversation, So I know I've sort of brought it up a couple of times, but, we'll do that in a follow-up podcast. But any last comments or thoughts you want to share before we sign off for today?
Do I have anything else? I think, no, I don't think there is anything else. I think we can't put the genie back in the bottle when it comes to the effects of digital. And we're going to have to live probably with more volatility and more polarization for the foreseeable future. I think that's kind of inevitable, but, the press is serving us best by uncovering both new information and also sifting information that's out there and presenting it in ways that are digestible and helpful to us. And that has a lot of value. And there's a lot of value in journalism that isn't trying to campaign for something, right? Journalism is just trying its best to the extent that is possible to be neutral, and kind of just give you the facts reasonably. vast majority of journalists I know want nothing more than to do good work. And they put their heart and soul into it, and are very, poorly compensated for it. Unfortunately, in many cases, it's a very small proportion of journalists that are highly paid and wealthy. Very small proportion, especially with economics of journalism now. Effectively, a lot of them are lucky to have jobs because that's how bad the environment is. But we need to value journalists and journalism as much as they are often disdained and criticized, and there are reasons to criticize them at times. But I would like to see more people who want good information out there and want the truth to be uncovered being willing to help them.
Well, thanks for today's conversation. I know we'll probably have more conversations around this issue and topic in the upcoming weeks, months, just because it feels very dynamic. And, I really do think the continued attacks on our First Amendment and the press is something, very worthy of us really digging into and paying attention to and pushing back against in any way that we can. But yeah, thank you for your time today. We'll hopefully have you back on soon to talk about a number of issues. Well, this is another episode of Trailblazing Justice. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening, and thanks to our producer, Todd Davila.